Hello and welcome everyone to the Varsity Tutor Star Course series, where it's summertime, and that means millions of people this summer will visit the national parks, which brings us to both the presenter and the star of today's show. We've got Josh Montanari right now from the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library and Museum here to talk to us, but a veteran of the National Park Service as well, here to talk all about Jimmy Carter's contributions to the expansion of the national parks. And we'll learn all about the most monumental, maybe since Teddy Roosevelt, expansion of the national parks through President Carter. And we're talking about national parks. We're talking about getting hands-on with some great American treasures. And so before I turn it over to Josh, we want to talk about getting hands-on here. You'll see there's a chat box to the right of the screen. Please, Josh is going to ask you some questions. Answer his questions there so we can keep it a running dialogue. We also want to hear your questions. If you've got any questions that pop up today about the life and times of President Carter, about the expansion of the national parks, kind of drawing on Josh's expertise as well, ask those questions in there. And in the last 10 minutes or so, almost said 10 seconds, we'll dedicate more time than that. In the last 10 minutes of today's program, I'll interview Josh with your questions to get you some answers. Also, one thing we all know about the national parks is you've got to get pictures, and they're never as great as the ones that the National Park Service puts out on their own, but they're very cool to memorialize your trip there. That's going to be a big theme of today as well. In about 40 minutes or so, we're going to give everyone an opportunity to lean into the screen and take a selfie to commemorate today's event. If you upload that to Instagram and tag Varsity Tutors, you'll be entered to win 3 free months of VT Plus, where you can learn about anything, including national parks. There's a link on your screen to learn more, but I talked enough. I want to turn it over to the star of today's show, Josh Montanari from the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library and Museum and the National Park Service. Josh, take it away.
Thank you very much, Brian. I'm going to go ahead and get my screen shared here. For some reason, it's there. We go. Okay. Okay, everybody. So today our topic is presidential power and precedents. And this is all about Jimmy Carter, Alaska, and the Antiquities Act. And today's program is really going to be almost an advanced version of how a bill becomes a law, more or less. Just a little background. Brian mentioned I work for the National Archives. We are like the nation's record keepers. More or less, we drive the transparency that Americans have with their government. Not always perfect, but we're as close as it gets. Something we're known for in the picture there. It looks kind of like a funeral happening, but it's actually a very joyous occasion with the Charters of Freedom being brought to their permanent home in the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. This was an agency established in the 1930s under the president who occupied the artifact you see in the middle of the screen. Went through some administrative changes over the years, but we have about 40 different facilities all around the country. Now, presidential libraries, which is overseen by the National Archives, this is not something mandatory for any president to have. It's a choice of outgoing presidents. The first was established by Franklin Delano Roosevelt for Franklin Delano Roosevelt while he was in office. His predecessor, Herbert Hoover, chose to share in that tradition. And every president through Barack Obama has also chosen to do so. We haven't heard yet if our last president, President Trump, will have one yet or not. He has held off on the announcement for that. But the way this typically works is if a president chooses to have this public-facing facility, that they will have to raise the money for construction, to purchase the land that it will be built on. And typically once that is complete, then management is handed over to the National Archives and Records Administration. And many of these sites are also supported by nonprofit foundations, typically related to those presidents. Now, the Carter Presidential Library opened on Jimmy Carter's birthday in 1986. This one-term president has over 40 million pages of written materials, over 40,000 artifacts and objects, 500,000 photographs, thousands of hours of audio and videotape. And this is something to remember. Naturally, this was in the analog age. So just imagine a modern president, how much they accumulate, particularly film and audio. Now, what we're really all about is teaching with primary sources. And the reason we do that is because they make us question where information is coming from. They make us think, what was the original intent and context of this document, of this source, when you're seeing it on its own. Naturally, images, film, and audio kind of fill in some holes sometimes that written words or photographs can't do. They reveal intangible things to us. And when we analyze multiple documents, we naturally get multiple perspectives, which is essential to any research that any teachers or students are doing. And it's important to remember that no single source should have all of the information you want. Then it's probably not the best source. You should have a source that prompts further inquiry to gain those multiple perspectives. And that's what we're going to be doing here today. So just an overview, we'll be talking about Alaska and the United States, about Jimmy Carter's conservation record, about the Antiquities Act of 1906, about the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, or ANILCA as it's known, and then the constitutional checks and balances involved in this. Now, why does the United States have Alaska? Before we had it, it was, by some accounts, belonged to Russia. Having been a national park ranger in Southeast Alaska, I learned that when Russians were there, they were there not to colonize, to expand their land, expand holdings. It was really to make a quick buck. They really were exploiting the fur trade, particularly sea otters, who have the densest fur on Earth. Just to give you an idea, 1 million hairs in every square inch of an otter's fur. I might be a little jealous of that. So they were there getting fur. They really never went more than 100 miles inland. So picture that map of Alaska, how vast it is, about a quarter of the size of the lower 48. And they really only went in 100 miles of that. But they felt that gave them the right to sell it to the United States. And that's what we see here is the check that the United States wrote to Alaska for $7.2 million. And this deal was brokered by United States Secretary of State William Seward, who you see on the right there. And this comes to be known as Seward's Folly. Because what do we want with this far north rugged land? It was good for fur trade, but when we buy it, the fur trade was waning. Naturally, sea otters had been hunted to near extinction. So it just kind of seemed like something nice to have, but it didn't really serve a purpose. But we discover later when we start doing energy discovery in that area that we find that it's worth quite a bit. And to this day, the United States has profited in excess of $3 trillion off of that $7.2 million investment. So it's worked out pretty well for us. So statehood does not come until 1959. So that's almost a century of being a territory of the United States. So it's President Eisenhower that declares Alaskan statehood. And in this is included a caveat for 104 million acres of land to go to the state of Alaska to do what it sees fit with for self-sustaining. Because something that worries the federal government is that being so far from the lower 48, that they might run into a few problems, logistically speaking. So this is supposed to be more or less a dowry or for sustenance of the state of Alaska. Now, natives, they want to know where they fit into all of this. We have Alaska Native cultures who have been subsisting off of this land for thousands of years. In 1971, we get the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, which provides 44 million acres of land to Alaska Native tribes and almost $1 billion. And that was divided among Native corporations that had to be formed to receive that money. And you can see the Secretary of Interior withdraws 80 million acres for future study. Now, these things have to be implemented by 1978. And that's where Jimmy Carter is going to come in. Naturally, he's in office at that time, but he's someone who has a background in conservation. going all the way back to his Depression-era childhood in rural Georgia. He really grows up with a faith-inspired environmentalism with his family, that we see some of which we see pictured here. As Georgia's governor, he establishes the Georgia Heritage Trust, and he vetoes more than 600 applications to drain swamplands, which, environmentally speaking, is kind of a big deal. We might have seen recent stories coming out of Florida with some problems there with the wetlands and the human imprint and a little bit of conflict. So that's a really, really huge thing for any governor to stand up that much against those. Now, when he runs for president in 1976, there is a lot of green momentum. The EPA, or Environmental Protection Agency, had been created in 1970, and then a slew of environmental legislation followed: the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, numerous federal regulations on pesticides and insecticides. So I think Jimmy Carter is going to capitalize on that attitude towards the environment in the United States at that time when he comes to office, and that he wants to see this conundrum of Alaska through that previous administrations have not gotten to yet. So he's very early in office, only a couple of weeks. He gives an environmental message to the nation. Among that message, pollution and health, energy and environment, the urban environment, which is now getting attention. There's a big problem across the country where we start to see a lot of cities in somewhat of a state of decay at that point. So that gets a focus. We have global environmentalism, national heritage, national resources, global environment. And Jimmy Carter thinks there's room to improve government efficiency to oversee changes in all of these things, to give them attention. So the state of Alaska, in addition for the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act having to be implemented, they're waiting for that 104 million acres of land that was promised to them when statehood came back in the Eisenhower administration. But again, all presidents and Congresses from that point on had more or less kicked the can down the road from that point. Well, the federal government misses the deadline to act on that 104 acres, so we see that the state of Alaska does file suit against the federal government. So we see the first page of that on the left. We then see Jimmy Carter asking for counsel. What do we do about this? And you see there where I've got circled, I seek your advice on the suitability of lands for designation as national monuments under the Antiquities Act of 1906. So this is where, again, how a bill becomes a law gets a little more complicated in some instances, where we're going to see a president asking about using other laws which will justify executive action to more or less curtail the legislative process, or at least to put pressure on the legislative process to be complete. And that's what Carter is going to be doing here. So he asks about the Antiquities Act. If you're not familiar with that, that is created in 1906. It really comes in response to artifacts in the American Southwest beginning to disappear at an alarming rate. A lot of what you would call pot hunters showing up in like Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, going to Puebloan dwellings. And so we want to try to stem that. And so we get this law, the Antiquities Act, which says a president can declare an area of the country that has scientific or cultural value, a national monument, to give it protection. So then if someone is still doing that potting, then there's a mechanism for accountability for prosecution if need be. So that's how this starts. But in the great American tradition of, you could say, vagary or missing a critical word here and there, naturally the law begins to be interpreted more widely. What a historic landmark could be, what objects of historic or scientific interest could be, what the smallest possible area necessary to protect a resource is. And a lot of that hinges on the science of the day when a particular area or site might be considered. So almost just about every president from Teddy Roosevelt to Jimmy Carter had used the Antiquities Act to declare national monuments, with many of them later becoming official national parks with congressional action. So looking at some other precedents of presidents using the Antiquities Act, one of the most notable cases is the case of Wyoming. In 1950, there's a compromise to establish Grand Teton National Park, which had been declared by Franklin Roosevelt during his presidency via the Antiquities Act. They did not respond to that very well in Wyoming, to say the least. So in 1950, we have this compromise where the federal government agrees to make an exception to the Antiquities Act. So they more or less make this statement that it's a pliable act on a case-by-case basis. So they come to the conclusion that no further extension or establishment of national parks and or monuments in Wyoming may be undertaken except by acts of Congress. So in other words, that has to be approved in both houses of Congress, has to be signed by the president, can't just be declared and later on. So to begin with, the Antiquities Act is now null and void in the state of Wyoming. So there's some precedent for having it used, and then for a state instituting some checks and balances. Now, Carter had asked advice on using the Antiquities Act. He does get his answer about that. They propose you take action under the Antiquities Act to create national monuments to provide strong and certain protection to the most critical areas. And he gets that advice from both the Secretary of Interior and Secretary of Agriculture, as well as White House counsel. They all are in agreement. There's precedents for this. You can do it. There's nothing stopping you, and there's a good chance maybe this will bring Congress to the table, which is what Jimmy Carter ultimately wants, because he does not want this to be seen as a unilateral action from the White House. He wants everyone to have a say in it. He wants all branches of government to come together to approve this. So Carter does invoke the Antiquities Act. He takes, in one stroke of his pen, he sets aside 56 million acres of land, and as Secretary of Interior withdraws an additional 40 million acres for a 20-year period for a study. So more or less what that means is, short of congressional action, it's going to tie up those lands. It's going to make this carry over to the next administration and perhaps beyond. So Carter has this action. Folks in Alaska, they have a reaction, and you can imagine it's not very good. There's a lot of misunderstanding about what is actually happening. When Carter does this, what's the end game of it? And the primary source that we're seeing from the University of Alaska is just one of many instances you would have seen in Alaska at that time of folks showing their disapproval for Carter's actions. That's him being burned in effigy. In fact, President Carter recalls being in Alaska, going to the state fair, and recalling that at a dunking booth, folks had a choice of throwing balls to either dunk the Ayatollah of Iran during the hostage crisis of Iran, or him. And he said it looked like most people were going for him. So that kind of tells you the emotions that were involved with this action. So Carter loses the 1980 election to Ronald Reagan. So many folks might think, well, that's going to be the end of this law, but really it's not, because what Carter again has done has said, I can use this Antiquities Act again and again. Maybe I'm going to withdraw another 25, maybe another 30, 40, 50 million acres. And I can do this until I'm out of office in January of 1981. So I think to avoid further complications, Congress comes to the table, they compromise, they pass the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, and it is signed by Jimmy Carter. So this is hailed by many as the most significant conservation legislation in United States history. And it's accomplished by what's called a lame duck president, someone who has lost the election and more or less is kind of waiting for the clock to run out. Although it's not really the case with Carter at that time. He's working to secure the release of the hostages in Iran. But this is a very huge deal when it comes to conservation, when it comes to federal public lands. And when this is signed, again, like we saw in Wyoming, there is a check and balance coming from the state, in this case, Alaska. So when this is signed, it is agreed that anything 5,000 acres or more has to be approved by Congress going forward. So Carter can still, or any president technically, can still claim through the Antiquities Act a new national monument in Alaska if it's a smaller historic site, preserve, what have you. Maybe it's a historic building. But things in Alaska tend to be large when they're set aside, with a couple of exceptions. So I think that kind of covered what they were looking for in that compromise. So we see following precedents, a new precedent established that we have even more wiggle room. We can put a specific acreage amount, size amount, on when congressional approval is needed concerning something set aside with the Antiquities Act. So this whole, this really is a great exercise in showing how government can function, how the potential it has to function, and versatility that politicians have, mainly a United States president in this case. But again, we see a genuine compromise taking place. Nothing's really unilateral here. And so when we talk about public lands, we're not just saying that Carter has set aside all these great parks for tourists and visitors to go and see. This is comprehensive guidance on federal public lands. I mean, it's really the reason we get folks interested in Alaska in the first place, right? The resources there, the potential profits that are there. So this guides wilderness subsistence for Alaska natives, like we see happening in the photograph here, transportation and utilities, oil and gas leasing. That's a big deal. Trans-Alaska Pipeline, which was established in '74, but this is going to give clear guidance for it. Mining, a big deal in Alaska to this very second. And then again, public access on land. So that's where your parks come into play. Your national wildlife refuges, national forest. Tongass National Forest was in the headlines in recent years, largest temperate rainforest in the world. And then hunting, trapping, and fishing, again, like we see happening there. So that's all of what is covered in this law. So it's extremely comprehensive, not just for tourism, for parklands. Although it is these parklands, and there were 34 of them, either established or affected by ANILCA, that really creates a permanent pipeline going to Alaska, and that would be the ecotourism pipeline. Now, I don't have the most recent numbers for that, but looking just back at 2017, 52,000 seasonal jobs in that state. And just to put in perspective, Alaska is huge, largest geographic state, like I said, somewhere around a quarter to a third of the lower 48, but it only has the population, I think, of about Baltimore City. So around 750,000 people spread out over what's about a third of the continental United States. So we can see some taxes and revenues come in there, visitor spending, labor income, so people are getting even more jobs. 2.24 million visitors to Alaska. They used to be in 3 digits in the 70s in many places. We just did not have people visiting Alaska. It was really your hardy travelers and adventurers that made it all the way up there to see these places. But now, like this picture here, just people can casually go to that part of the world. A lot of it via plane, cruise ship, railroad, all three. Some folks do when they're Alaskan experiences. But I think this was also part of Carter's vision for that state, giving it that permanent lifeline beyond fossil fuels, beyond mining, things of that nature. So Carter does get some belated recognition. He is made an honorary National Park Ranger by the National Park Service. During his term as president, he establishes 39 units of the National Park Service, and so that's just the Park Service. We're not talking the Forest Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Reclamation, Bureau of Land Management. So just in that one federal public lands agency, 39 National Park Service units. And he also contributes to the National Park Service urban agenda. As I mentioned, during his administration, they began looking inward in American cities, and parks are no different, that we have folks there that have resources, whether cultural or natural, that they can be connected to. And that's a great program that the Park Service continues to do today. So looking back, and this is where we can type in some responses, and this was kind of a straightforward lesson, I think. But looking at these questions, did Carter's use of the Antiquities Act in Alaska exceed constitutional powers of the executive branch? And were there checks or balances applied to his actions by the legislative or judicial branches or state governments? And that third one, how has the Antiquities Act strengthened or weakened democracy? And that question, I think, is really great for a facilitated dialogue with students. You know, how has this served to stimulate civic engagement? But I think it has that great potential on both sides of the argument. So don't think that this is a one-sided argument, that it's gotten people to really care about their parks and sets, you know, there's two sides to every coin. You know, and not just gets people engaged, I think, for advocating for parks. Maybe there's always the local interest. There's always financial interest involved. And I think often they all have legitimate arguments for what they're advocating for. But if we want to have some folks chime in and maybe put what they view if President Carter acted within the powers of the executive branch, and whether this was had checks or balances applied. So let's just hear some of your thoughts on that. Okay. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. So the Congress passed a law that was signed by a president to give all other presidents this power. Had been challenged in the Supreme Court. Court upholds it. We do see these, the examples of Wyoming and Alaska. So it's very, it really is endlessly fascinating, this law, that you think its pliability, it would be interesting to see how it does get applied going forward in different states, because maybe we see more of these unique arrangements with individual states going forward when new areas are declared. I mean, we have had some recent events with the Antiquities Act, where a notable one would be Bears Ears National Monument, which was set aside by President Obama to protect the cultural area to Indigenous Americans. It was shrunken by the Trump administration, exercising their right to say what they thought was the smallest possible area needed to protect these resources. Then the Biden administration comes in and puts it back to the boundaries it was before. So it really is a law with endless possibilities. And I'm very interested to see how it continues to evolve going forward. So at this time, if folks got some questions for me about whether it's about the Antiquities Act, whether about ANILCA, or just anything about the Carter Library, Carter administration, happy to answer any questions that folks have.
Hey, thanks, Josh. And yeah, we do have some great questions coming in. So everybody keep those coming. And I know we've got some national parks enthusiasts here. So we got some questions about the parks, about some other, what were the back and forth in Wyoming and all those. Josh, I think before we get into the questions, I want to give everybody one more chance to kind of think through what's on your mind and get out there. The other thing we want to make sure everybody had a chance to do is lean into the screen, get a selfie. Josh is a celebrity in his own right, but we actually have a great picture of Jimmy Carter becoming an honorary park ranger. We can let everybody get in and get a picture with that. So remember, while you get your cameras ready, if you upload your picture to Instagram and tag Varsity Tutors, you'll be entered to win 3 free months of VT Plus, which you can learn about with a link on your screen right there. I think that gives everybody the opportunity to get those cameras out. And so why don't we give everybody about 15 seconds to get this picture. This is a picture of President Carter becoming an honorary National Parks Ranger, and in honor of his contributions to the national park. So I'll get my camera out of the way and let everybody get that picture. All right, Josh, and we can get you back. Let's do some Q&A. Thanks everybody for all your great questions. Again, we'll have on a slide in just a second as we're wrapping up. We'll have the official handle. It's just at Varsity Tutors on Instagram, and you'll be entered to win. I think one pretty common question we had, Josh, was like I mentioned, a lot of people are here. They like the national park. They may be planning some trips this summer, and they've been a little surprised to learn that Wyoming was a lot of people were disappointed in and wanted to negotiate almost an end to a national park expansion after Grand Tetons, the hanging of or burning of President Carter in effigy, with related to all the expansion in Alaska. What were some of the reasons that folks were upset about the expansion of national parks? I think we've got you on mute there.
Yep. I think a lot of folks naturally were worried about their livelihoods. You have a lot of ranching going on, like in the case of Wyoming, particularly ranchers. They didn't know what to expect. They didn't know what was coming. Are we ever going to be are we going to have any land left? Is this going to just keep happening? Because Wyoming's beautiful all over. Where do we draw the line? When do we stop just declaring these national parks? In the case of kind of the same thing in Alaska, but different industries, not so much cattle up in Alaska. Fish are their cattle, but mining, you think of mining, timber, oil and gas, leasing, all of that, even just subsistence, there's naturally, a knee-jerk reaction. Is this going to affect my livelihood? Is it going to be negative? And usually if it's something coming down from the federal government, it can be seen, as one-sided and kind of a unilateral action that doesn't, I think, involve people in the process. But when you look at the details, it was an extremely long process that the government had been working on for decades and decades. And as mentioned, that was just a step Carter was taking to more or less nudge Congress in the direction of getting it done, where everybody did have a say at the table, and it reflected a compromise.
Well, thank you. Good to see both sides of that story as well. It's also, a generation or a couple generations later to be able to visit those parks and see the beauty. Of course, it seems like it worked out well for those of us who have gotten to visit, but that's the benefit of hindsight and distance in so many.
Right. And I think a lot of folks realize that years later who had been opposed to these, they realize, hey, this is an economic powerhouse now thanks to this. Even if it's just seasonal, it's made a huge difference in people's lives in Alaska.
Speaking of that, a lot of questions, centering around, what were the particular parks for anybody planning a visit up to Alaska. Can you talk about some of the highlights of what President Carter set aside? Specifically, people want to know what's the first park he set aside, what's the most popular, but even just to kind of package that maybe in a more open-ended way, what are some of the highlights that we may be able to go check out someday?
I would say, as far as public access, places that have the easiest and most convenient public access is typically going to be the coastal parks in Alaska in the southeast, Glacier Bay National Park, Kenai Fjords. A lot of folks take the cruise ships from from Washington up to Seward, and maybe they go see Kenai Fjords, and then they get on the Alaska Railroad to take that up to Denali, which is in the interior, which CART doesn't create, but it's impacted by ANILCA, where they add a preserve aspect to it for Alaska Native subsistence. And the name of the mountain, which had been Mount McKinley, was reverted to its native name of Denali. Although the park name is Mount McKinley National Park until a little bit later when it comes to, I'm sorry, I'm getting this backwards. Pardon me, folks. The park becomes Denali National Park. The mountain doesn't change till Denali until the Obama administration. That's years later. And that was something held up apparently by the congressional delegation of Ohio, who didn't want to see their native son's name removed from the mountain. And it was just an arbitrary naming during the 1896 election, kind of a publicity stunt to start calling it Mount McKinley, and it kind of stuck. And they've been trying to change it ever since, but there's folks in Ohio holding it up. Sorry, no offense to anyone in Ohio.
That's you're right to be proud of a native son president, but yeah, I think we in the end the local name and the name of the park won. I do remember that wasn't that long. It was probably 6-7 years ago.
In fact, I was working at Denali National Park at the time it happened, and the Secretary of Interior found a rule that says if it's anything geographically labeled on a map, they can change it. They can change the name of it, and that's what then Secretary of State Sally Jewell, not State, Interior, Sally Jewell did. She changed it to Denali, and again, that was not something. A lot of folks might have thought that was the federal government cramming that down Alaska's throat. No, that was 99% of Alaskans for the last 100 years saying, please change it back.
Wow, that's glad that finally got done for them, and it's just no offense to President McKinley, but Denali is just such a kind of an iconic name. So very cool. Hey, a lot of other questions too about just national parks in general. It's summertime, that makes sense, and you've worked for the National Park Service, and proudly and enjoyed a lot of it. What would you say is your favorite national park? And can you tell us a little bit about what are the most accessible or popular national parks for people to visit?
Let's see. Well, the popular ones people visit are kind of the big well-known ones: Yellowstone, Yosemite, Glacier National Park, and those they're really kind of hurting right now. They're really being hit hard, and actually, we all want to get back out, and we have been getting out. Now we're all really getting out. So I'd say if you want to visit, start making reservations now, because campgrounds are filling up, hotels are filling up. Plan it as far in advance as you like. Make sure you check about the seasonal aspects. I had a cousin-in-law who got married, and her and her husband wanted to go to Yellowstone. I think it was in April, and I told them it's going to be feet of snow on the ground still. It's going to be below freezing temperatures, but but naturally, a lot of folks aren't quite up on that. So do your research before you go. That's what I would say: is do the research. As far as my favorite national park, I would have to say Crater Lake National Park in Southwest Oregon was my favorite park. That has the deepest lake in the United States. It sounds crazy, but you can see about 100 feet into the surface because the water's so clear, because it's all just fed by snow melt and rain. And I really like that park because it's kind of like the Grand Canyon in that you can enjoy it from the rim, or you can have a good time going down into it. So at Crater Lake, you can still have a great experience driving the rim road, it's called, around the lake. There's, I think 30 something different pullovers you can stop at, or you can hike down into the caldera. It's actually a caldera, not a crater, because it wasn't a meteorite. This was a mountain, and then it collapsed in on itself after an eruption. But you can hike down in, and they do have boat tours. And you can even swim in it if you like. Can be a little scary. I jumped in once. I looked down. I felt like I was floating in space because I could see 100 feet down, and that was kind of scary to me. Made me feel a little small, so I got right back out. But other folks have different tolerance for that. But beautiful park. It's about 4 hours north of Redwoods National Park, so I think that's a great combo trip for people to get some California and Oregon time in.
That's amazing. I'm ready to go. I need to like if any of my bosses are watching it, PTO request coming in. That sounds fantastic. I'll put in a little plug for it. I live not far from where the boats leave for Channel Islands National Park.
Oh, okay.
The coast of Southern California, and
There you go.
to your family's mistakes, I've definitely gone out there in February and thought that's a beautiful day inland in California. It shouldn't be that cold out there, and then you camp overnight and definitely read ahead because you got to be ready for everything. But some amazing national parks out there, which leads me. I think we got time maybe for 2 more questions. I'll try to sneak in a couple others in. But so people are asking about you. You've lived a pretty cool life working for national parks and national archives and everything. One is people want to know: have you met Jimmy Carter? Have you worked with Jimmy Carter? How is he in real life? What questions can you answer for us about just sort of the man himself, Jimmy Carter?
So I have met President Carter on a few occasions. I haven't had a one-on-one, us just meeting exclusively, so to speak, but I've been in audiences with him on a few occasions. I think the best would probably be when I was able to take some interns of mine and joined Carter Center Interns. That's a nonprofit we share a campus with that's run by the Carters. We went down to Plains, Georgia, where the Carters still reside, which is about a 3 to 4 hour drive south of Atlanta, Georgia. So it's rural Georgia, no skyscrapers down this way. And we were in an audience with President Carter at the National Park Service Visitor Center there because he has his national park, Jimmy Carter National Historical Park. And he told us experiences about his lives, but he opened it up for questioning with the audience. And I was able to ask a question about the Camp David Peace Accords. And I got to ask him, what did you say to Anwar Sadat that convinced him not to leave? Because he was about to leave and the whole thing was about to crumble. And Carter has said in one of his books that this was the most uncomfortable conversation of my entire life. So I asked him what he had to say. And one thing I will say about President Carter has these ice blue eyes will cut through the room. And he really was focused on me while he was answering my question. But more or less, he told me that he had formed a very close personal friendship with Anwar Sadat. And it was an uncomfortable conversation because he knew he had, in the position he was in as president of the United States, he had to go threaten his very good friend if he intended on leaving these peace accords. And so that's why that was, I guess, not a fun experience for President Carter, but it was really cool to be able to talk directly with the president, even if it's just one question, and have a response directed at me. But he was, from the times I saw him, still very sharp. Still has that big grin on his face. And I think now he's kind of pulling back. He's not a spring chicken in his early 90s anymore. So he and Rosalind are, I think, leading a little bit more private life these days. But the Carter Center's had the reins handed over to his grandson, Jason Carter, and I think they're in very good hands. And hopefully, we still get to hear more about the Carters for a few more years.
Man, what an amazing experience. And to use your question on something, kind of insider and, the fact that he was ready to answer that, that's really amazing. That's such a cool experience.
He was having book signings at our library. Whenever he released a book, President Carter wrote over 30 books. Whenever he would release a new one, he would do a signing at the library. One of them, I was asked to come and I got to be, I think, 2 spaces down from him. And so I was laying out, people were coming up with books and I was putting the pages out, passing them over. But the interesting aspect of working at a library with a living president is you have Secret Service around you. And so they're kind of hovering around you. And there was another event, I was getting events mixed up, to where he was speaking for a fundraiser. And I was there to give some folks tours of the museum. And at the end of one tour, I gave a group of folks, they said, "You are the most informative Secret Service guard. Like, how do you know all of these things?" And I said, "Well, why do you think I'm one of the Secret Service agents?" I said, "I'm not so spry." They said, "Well, go out and look at the other guys when you get back out there." And I went back, I said, "Yeah, they're all kind of bald and bearded and burly," with some exceptions. And I had a suit and tie. Okay, I could see how you might,
It's a built-in
Nice.
Halloween costume for you. That's
Yeah,
perfect.
some folks thought they were getting a very exclusive museum tour from a Secret Service agent who had time to step away from the president they were protecting.
Yeah, they probably shouldn't allow themselves to be that distracted.
Yeah, I was probably supposed to be over there. I got some tours in the museum, though. I'm going to be over here.
Or you were just doing a really good undercover job of feeling them out. There's some kind of reason.
I've seen it a couple times.
That's amazing. Hey, last question for you. I think a lot of folks, would love to visit the Jimmy Carter Library Museum, or just, in general, presidential libraries. I think there are so many spread across the country. If you can't quite get to Atlanta, there are others. What are some, your favorite reasons to visit the Carter Museum, or just presidential libraries and museums in general? What's your advice for folks who have some time to spend over the summer doing those things, and things are opening up and there's opportunities to do it? Why visit the Carter Museum, and why visit presidential museums in general?
So just to know, with the presidential libraries, they're all opening at kind of different rates in response to the pandemic conditions in their communities. The Carter Library doesn't have an official open date. We think we're going to be open on a self-guided basis this summer. We don't have a definite date, but we're feeling strongly that it could happen before the end of the summer. So please check our website for the details on that. But why visit the Carter Library, or I think any presidential library? I think is to, and I think in one aspect, become a historian. Come learn about a president through the primary sources of their administration, not just what your uncle told you at a family barbecue about this president or that, or what you heard from your teacher, even, or what. Come and find out for yourself. That's what I tell students all the time: is be your own historian. Come look at these primary sources, make up your own mind about what this history means to you and to our nation. So at the Carter Library, we have a lot of great ways to connect with Carter's early life, his life in the Navy, his life back in Georgia following the Navy, and then where his political career is. We have a replica of the Oval Office, great for selfies. And we also have a great space dedicated to his post-presidency. You may or may not know about the Carter Center. You've heard it mentioned here. A lot of us tend to think that Jimmy and Rosalind Carter just help out Habitat for Humanity a couple times a year. That's the least of all the things they do. The Carter Center's got health and peace programs in over 80 countries around the world. So about 1/3 of our museum space is dedicated to that work Jimmy Carter has done since leaving the presidency in 1981. A lot of it very moving: eradication of diseases, election monitoring in South America. A lot of great things to discover there. And other presidential libraries have amazing things to discover. Many of them are fairly recent. Some have gotten revamped. The Eisenhower Library was just renovated. Truman Library is being renovated as we speak. There's always what we call the jewel of the presidential libraries, the Reagan Library, where they have Air Force One that you can get on. So yeah, get out and see them. I think you'll not only discover something about our history, about our country, you'll discover something about yourself.
Well, that's great advice. Yeah, I've been to a few of them. They're always time well spent. The one piece of advice I have is overestimate how much time you think you'll spend there. If you think you spend 2 hours. I've had a couple of them where I've had to kind of make a note. Like, next time I'm in this town, I'm going to come back. I didn't see everything I wanted to.
You're right. Depending where you're at, there might be a whole lot. Like the Franklin Roosevelt Library is within the Roosevelt National Historical Park. So there's also the national park to see, in addition to the Presidential Library and Museum. So again, just like national parks, with libraries, plan ahead.
Exactly. Well, great advice, I think, to anyone planning anything out this summer, or really any other time. Of course, a former national park ranger is going to give us the best possible advice on having a great trip. Hey, thanks so much, Josh, for all of your insight, for some really amazing information. I think discussion questions that I hope continue, around dinner tables around America tonight as a result of that. Thanks to all of you out there who ask questions, answer questions, and put your selfies up on Instagram. We always love checking those out after class. And so with that, let me give you your instructions. If you do want to get those selfies, up on Instagram, here's the handle of the tag. And if you're a little camera shy, you can just take a photo of the photo on the screen here, and that will work to enter you in the contest as well. So Josh, thanks again. Thanks to everyone out there for some amazing questions and participation. And we wish everybody a great summer, no matter which park or museum. We should put those as plural you decide to visit. And we'll see everybody again soon.
Take care, guys.